July 19th, 1943. The Vichy district, occupied France. It's hot, desert hot. The kind of heat that clings to your skin and leaves salt trails down your neck. The cobblestones shimmer like dark water. Sunlight glints off distant windows, sending Morse code flashes across the square. Somewhere in a nearby cafe, a gramophone scratches out an old Edith Piaf tune, barely audible beneath the crisp rhythm of German boots on stone. Inside a small attic apartment overlooking the central plaza, a woman named Eleanor Blackwood adjusts the frequency dial on a wireless transmitter. Her fingernails aren't manicured. They're cut short, practical. The transmitter isn't sitting on a table. It's hidden inside a hollowed-out suitcase, propped against a wall. Her back isn't to the window. It's facing it, the outline of her silhouette deliberately visible to anyone watching from the street below. Eleanor doesn't speak. Her breath steadies as she taps out a message in code. Her fingers move with practiced precision, a rhythm as natural as heartbeats. The man beside her glances at his watch and whispers, 3 minutes, then we go. Eleanor continues transmitting. The encoded message contains troop movements, patrol schedules, and the location of a German ammunition depot. Information that took weeks to gather, seconds to send, and could cost dozens of lives if intercepted. Then, from the street below, the sound of vehicles braking hard, car doors slamming, orders shouted in German. Eleanor doesn't flinch. She finishes the transmission, one final sequence. The man hisses, "They're coming! Now!" But Eleanor Blackwood doesn't rush. She disconnects the antenna, closes the suitcase with steady hands, and slides it beneath a loose floorboard. She turns to her companion, eyes clear and focused. "We're not going out the door," she says, moving toward the fireplace. "We're going through the building. Because this isn't panic, this is protocol. This is what happens when a classics professor from Cambridge rewrites the rules of espionage by turning traditional tradecraft inside out and turning herself into the most effective Allied agent in occupied France. They doubted her. They said women weren't built for field work until she proved otherwise. And when the dust finally settled, the Germans weren't the only ones surprised. The spy no one expected. Before she became the woman who outfoxed the Gestapo and rewrote Allied intelligence operations in occupied France, Eleanor Blackwood was just another academic from Sussex. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't reckless. She didn't grow up around spies or even intrigue. She grew up translating dead languages. Her father was an antiquities curator. Her mother taught music, and like many brilliant minds before the war, Eleanor dedicated herself to scholarship because she found clarity in ancient texts that modern life rarely offered. She never imagined she would end up running a resistance network in the heart of occupied territory, let alone commanding one of the most successful intelligence operations of the entire European theater. Eleanor trained at Cambridge University, where she specialized in classical and Romance languages. Her colleagues noted she had an exceptional memory, an ear for linguistic patterns, and a methodical approach to problem solving that most academics lacked. While others studied texts for content, Eleanor analyzed structure. She identified patterns. She anticipated meaning. Still, no one noticed her. She wasn't flamboyant. She wasn't politically vocal. And in a field where bold theories often commanded attention, Eleanor stayed in the background until the fall of France. By the time British intelligence services began desperately recruiting linguists in June 1940, the war had shifted. The Nazis had conquered Western Europe. Britain stood alone, reeling from Dunkirk, bracing for invasion. But now came the hard part. building a resistance network behind enemy lines, establishing communication channels through territory crawling with Gestapo, Abwehr, and collaborators ready to betray their countrymen for a loaf of bread. That's where the Special Operations Executive came in. The SOE was Britain's sabotage and subversion unit. More than 13,000 agents served during the war, with around 3,200 women among them, making it one of the most diverse intelligence operations in history. But the SOE had problems, serious ones. Its agents were being caught at an alarming rate. Its radio operators rarely lasted more than 6 weeks before detection. Its networks were infiltrated, compromised, and dismantled with ruthless efficiency by German counterintelligence. Still, the SOE had advantages. It was innovative, relatively unburdened by tradition, and when given proper support, its agents could spark resistance movements that tied down thousands of German troops. But it required tradecraft, and it required operatives willing to rethink everything they'd been taught about survival. That's where Eleanor came in. After 4 months of intensive training in Scotland, her superiors noted something unusual. While other recruits focused on mastering established protocols, Eleanor questioned them. "Why do radio operators always work from fixed safe houses?" she asked during a training session. "Why not transmit from places Germans would never search? Churches during services, Nazi headquarters during shift changes, in plain sight where suspicion is naturally lowest." Her instructor, Major William Thorne, a veteran of the Great War with a scar running across his left cheek, laughed. "Because that's suicidal," he said. "You stick to protocols, you survive, you improvise, you die." But Eleanor wasn't being reckless. She was identifying patterns. The Germans were catching British agents because they were looking for people behaving like spies, people hiding, people acting secretively. What if, Eleanor suggested, the best cover wasn't to hide, but to be visible in ways the enemy wouldn't expect? Thorne stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "That's the quickest ticket to a firing squad I've ever heard," he said. But Eleanor wasn't joking. She was already planning how to reshape the entire approach to field operations. Rejection, trial, and a signal through the static. At first, no one took Eleanor seriously. The idea of conducting espionage in plain sight, of using visibility as cover rather than concealment, was laughable to most SOE trainers. They called it academic naivete. They said she was trying to fight the Gestapo like a chess player faces a street brawler, using theory against brutality. Major Thorne, the training coordinator, made it clear. This isn't the kind of war where you get to experiment with pretty theories. You make one mistake, and you're not just dead. You compromise every agent connected to you. But Eleanor didn't back down. She kept thinking, kept analyzing patterns, kept running probability calculations in her notebooks, identifying German search methodologies, patrol routines, surveillance techniques. She studied the cases of captured agents, especially radio operators who'd been caught in the act of transmission. Most had been detected using the conventional methods they'd been taught, working from attics, basements, isolated farmhouses, using curtains and physical barriers to conceal themselves. These methods had worked early in the war, but the Germans had adapted. They now had radio detection vans that could triangulate transmissions within minutes. They knew exactly what to look for: people behaving secretively, unusual activity at odd hours, the telltale signs of tradecraft taught in training schools. If the Germans knew what to look for, Eleanor reasoned, then the solution wasn't better hiding. It was changing what they were looking for entirely. Still, No one approved her approach until one afternoon in late February 1943. London was gray, bombed out, exhausted. The SOE had just received word that another network in northern France had been compromised. 5 agents captured, 2 executed immediately. The rest sent to concentration camps. Their radio operator had been caught in a farmhouse outside Lille, detected by a mobile tracking unit within 18 minutes of beginning transmission. That night, Eleanor made her move. She requested a meeting with Sir Charles Hammond, Deputy Director of SOE Operations. Against all protocol, he granted it, not because he believed in her theories, but because they were running out of options. "What you're suggesting," Hammond said, after listening to her proposal, "is to deliberately expose our agents rather than conceal them." "No, sir," Eleanor replied. "I'm suggesting we conceal them through selective exposure. The Germans expect us to hide. They've optimized their entire counterintelligence apparatus around finding people who are trying not to be found. What if we operated where they'd never think to look?" Hammond, a tall man with tired eyes and a reputation for caution, studied her for a long moment. "Give me one concrete example," he said. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Radio transmission. Instead of operating from isolated locations, our operators should transmit from locations adjacent to German installations during predictable events. Shift changes, inspections, air raids, times when electrical activity is expected and attention is diverted. And if they're caught, they'll have better escape routes than an isolated farmhouse. Urban environments offer multiple exit points. Crowds provide cover. And most importantly, they'll be operating in the last place the Germans would expect." Hammond didn't approve the plan immediately, but he didn't reject it either. "Develop it further," he told her. "Show me data, not just theory." Eleanor did more than develop it. She volunteered to test it herself. 3 weeks later, after intensive specialized training, she was parachuted into occupied France under the code name Athena. Her mission wasn't just to gather intelligence, but to prove that her entire approach to fieldcraft could work where traditional methods were failing. The jump that changed everything. Eleanor's parachute descent into France wasn't just the beginning of her mission. It was the first test of her theory. Unlike other agents who were dropped in remote areas, she landed just 3 miles from a small town with a known German garrison. The conventional wisdom said to avoid populated areas after a drop, to hide and move only at night. Eleanor did the opposite. She buried her parachute, changed into civilian clothes, and walked directly into town as dawn broke. She joined early morning shoppers at the local market, purchased bread, and took a bus to her destination. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. She was visible, therefore unsuspicious. By the time she reached Lyon, she had already disproven the first assumption of traditional tradecraft. Her contact, a French resistance fighter, code-named Martin, was skeptical when they met at a cafe near the train station. "You're not what we expected," he said, eyeing her simple dress and practical shoes. "That," Eleanor replied, "is precisely the point." Within days, she began rebuilding a network that had been devastated by German infiltration. But she didn't use the old methods. She created a cell structure unlike any the SOE had implemented before. Instead of isolated operatives rarely meeting, she established teams that operated in plain sight, using legitimate businesses as covers. Her radio operator wasn't hidden in an attic. He worked as a repairman in a shop directly across from German headquarters. He transmitted during air raid sirens, when electrical interference was at its peak, and Germans were focused on taking shelter. Her courier wasn't a shadowy figure passing messages in dead drops. She was an elderly woman who delivered flowers to German officers, messages concealed in arrangements that sat on their own desks. Eleanor herself adopted multiple identities, none of them particularly secretive. A shop girl, a clerical worker, a charwoman who cleaned offices in buildings requisitioned by the occupation authority. Martin watched her work with growing amazement. "This is either brilliance or madness," he told her one evening. "I haven't decided which." Eleanor smiled. The line between the two is often thinner than we think. Her first major intelligence coup came 6 weeks after her arrival. By working as a cleaner in a building that housed administrative offices, she gained access to unguarded documents that detailed the coastal defenses along a section of the Atlantic Wall. Conventional agents might have attempted to photograph or steal these papers. Eleanor simply memorized them, page by page, using the mnemonic techniques she'd developed studying ancient texts. That night, her team transmitted the information to London using their unusual methods. The radio operator set up on the roof of a building during a German staff party on the floor below, the antenna disguised as a clothesline. The transmission went undetected. 3 days later, RAF bombers struck precisely the weak points she had identified. The Germans never suspected the information had come from their own headquarters area. London was finally paying attention. Hammond sent a coded message. Method showing promise. Continue. But success brought dangers. The Germans weren't fools. They began to notice the pattern of intelligence leaks, the precision of Allied bombing runs, the uncanny timing of resistance activities. They didn't know who was responsible, but they knew someone was operating in their midst. In response, Eleanor pushed her theories even further. If the Germans were looking harder for unusual behavior, then her network would become even more ordinary, more visible, more integrated into daily life under occupation. She recruited people the Germans would never suspect: an elderly priest, a teenage bicycle messenger, a woman with a reputation for collaborating with the enemy. Each played a specific role, none knowing the full extent of the network. When the Gestapo increased random document checks, Eleanor's team created a system to warn each other using everyday signals. A particular newspaper displayed in a shop window, a specific flower placed in a bicycle basket, a certain melody whistled in the street. As spring turned to summer, her network expanded. Intelligence flowed back to London. Troop movements, supply vulnerabilities, the identities of collaborators, and most crucially, the locations of V-1 rocket launch sites being constructed to bombard England. But the greater their success, the greater the pressure. The Germans began executing hostages in retaliation for resistance activities. They brought in specialized counterintelligence units. They offered rewards for information. Eleanor's methods were working, but the human cost was mounting. And somewhere in the shadows, a hunt was beginning, not just for any spy, but for the mastermind who had transformed Allied intelligence operations across the region. The woman they would soon codename the Invisible. The breaking point in a theory proven in blood. June of 1943 wasn't just another month in occupied France. It was a turning point. The Germans, stung by increased resistance activity and the precision of Allied bombing, launched Operation Spinninets, Spiderweb, a coordinated counterintelligence sweep across the entire Vichy region. The Gestapo brought in specialists from Berlin. Radio detection teams worked around the clock. Checkpoints multiplied overnight. Even loyal French citizens were subjected to harsh interrogations. The noose was tightening. In a small cafe near the Lyon train station, Eleanor sat with Martin, now her chief lieutenant, planning their next move. The cafe was crowded with German officers, precisely why she had chosen it. No one would expect resistance leaders to meet surrounded by the enemy. "They're getting closer," Martin said quietly, his coffee untouched. "3 of our people have disappeared in the last week. We should suspend operations." Eleanor stirred her ersatz coffee, eyes scanning the room with practiced casualness. "Suspending now would be a mistake," she replied. "They're looking for people who are hiding. We need to be more visible, not less." Martin looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "More visible? They're rounding up suspects by the dozen. And who are they arresting? People who act secretively, people who avoid Germans, people who fit the profile of resistance members." She leaned forward slightly. "What if we became the opposite? What if our next operation happened right under their noses, in a way so brazen they'd never believe it was real?" The target was significant. A German communications center that coordinated troop movements across southern France. Destroying it would cripple Nazi response capabilities for weeks. But it was housed in the former town hall, heavily guarded and considered impenetrable. Eleanor's plan was audacious. Rather than a covert attack, she proposed something unprecedented, a diversion that used German psychology against itself. "We'll create not one incident, but 3, she explained to her core team that evening. "The first 2 will be small, designed to draw security away from the main target. But more importantly, they'll establish a pattern the Germans will expect us to follow." The operation began on a sweltering Tuesday. At precisely 10:00 a.m., a small explosion damaged a power station on the eastern edge of the city. 2 hours later, as German forces responded, a second explosion disabled a railway junction to the north. The German commander, following protocol, anticipated a third strike to complete the triangle, likely targeting the western industrial zone. He diverted forces accordingly, pulling guards from central installations to reinforce the predicted target area. But Eleanor had never planned a third explosion. Instead, as attention focused elsewhere, her team executed the real mission. A cleaning crew, actual cleaners who had worked in the building for months, supplemented by resistance members disguised as maintenance workers, entered the communications center through the front door, carrying their usual supplies. Inside those supply carts, components for a sophisticated time-delay incendiary device, unlike anything the Germans had encountered before. It wasn't designed to explode, but to burn so hot it would destroy the sensitive electronic equipment without causing structural damage that might harm civilians in adjacent buildings. The devices were planted during normal cleaning routines, in ventilation ducts and beneath floorboards. No one raised an alarm. No one noticed anything unusual. The team walked out as they had walked in, nodding politely to the reduced guard contingent. At 8:37 p.m., as the German commander was concluding that the resistance had failed in their third attack, the communication center erupted from within. Specialized compounds ignited, reaching temperatures that melted wiring, destroyed vacuum tubes, and reduced codebooks to ash. The facility was gutted while the building itself remained largely intact. By the time fire crews responded, Eleanor's team had dispersed, each member returning to their daily lives as if nothing had happened. No dramatic escape, no shootout, no heroic last stand, just ordinary people blending back into the city. The German response was furious but confused. They had no witnesses, no suspects who fit their profile of resistance fighters. They arrested dozens of people who matched their idea of what saboteurs should be. Men of military age, known troublemakers, political dissidents, while Eleanor's actual team remained untouched. London was stunned by the success. Hammond's decoded message was uncharacteristically emotional. Athena's method vindicated, expanding to other sectors immediately. But victory came at a cost. The Germans, humiliated by the attack, intensified their brutality. Public executions increased. Innocent hostages were shot in retaliation. Eleanor, watching from the crowd as 10 civilians were lined up against a wall, felt the weight of each death like a stone. That night, alone in her rented room, she wept for the first time since entering France. Not from fear, but from the terrible clarity of knowing that her success meant others would suffer. The theoretical had become viscerally real. Martin found her the next morning, composed again, planning their next operation. "How do you bear it?" he asked quietly. "By remembering that for every person they kill trying to find us, we save 100 others by hastening the end of this war," she answered. "And by promising myself that when it's over, I'll remember every face, every name, every life that purchased our victory." It was the only moment of doubt she allowed herself, because the woman who had rewritten the rules of espionage understood that hesitation wasn't just dangerous, it was a luxury they couldn't afford. The method proven in blood was working, and stopping now would mean those sacrifices had been in vain. The unexpected success drew attention not just from London, but from the highest levels of German counterintelligence. Someone was dismantling their security from within, and traditional methods were failing to catch them. A specialist was needed, someone who thought differently. So Berlin sent Colonel Werner Kleist, not to hunt for typical resistance fighters, but to find the mind behind them. The unseen chess match between Eleanor and Kleist had begun, and the next move would reshape the entire underground war. From theory to legend, word of the communication center operation spread through resistance networks faster than the Germans could contain it. Within days, underground newspapers were reporting a devastating blow against the occupation authorities. Ordinary citizens whispered about it over ration lines and in crowded trams. "Did you hear about the Germans' communication center?" one baker asked a customer while German soldiers stood nearby. Destroyed from within, no one saw a thing. Most resistance cells didn't know who had planned the operation. Some attributed it to London, others to various resistance leaders. Few suspected the architect was a woman who had arrived in France just months earlier. But Colonel Werner Kleist was already assembling the puzzle pieces. A methodical investigator with a background in academic criminology, he approached counterintelligence differently than his Gestapo colleagues. Where they relied on brutality and fear, Kleist studied patterns and psychology. He requisitioned reports from across the region, looking not for dramatic actions, but for subtle anomalies. He noted that successful intelligence operations had increased dramatically in specific sectors since April. The attacks showed precision and inside knowledge that couldn't be explained by standard resistance methods. Most tellingly, the perpetrators weren't being caught despite intensified security. That suggested not just skill, but an entirely new approach. When his subordinates suggested increasing arrests and interrogations, Kleist shook his head. "We're not looking for the usual suspects," he told his team during a briefing at Gestapo headquarters. "We're looking for someone thinking several moves ahead, someone who understands that the best place to hide is where we're not looking." Unwittingly, he had articulated Eleanor's central theory. In London, SOE headquarters was taking notice as well. Eleanor's coded reports detailed not just intelligence gathered, but the methodology behind her operations. Hammond began implementing elements of her approach across other networks in occupied Europe. Radio operators were instructed to transmit during air raids or other moments of electrical activity. Agents were advised to establish legitimate covers rather than operating from shadows. Some veteran operatives resisted the changes, calling them reckless, but the results were undeniable. Detection rates dropped, intelligence flow increased. The Athena protocols, as they were informally known, were saving lives and improving operational effectiveness. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued to evolve her methods. She established what she called transparency cells, resistance members who operated without traditional secrecy, using their actual identities and legitimate occupations as cover. The florist who delivered bouquets to German headquarters really was a florist. The mechanic who repaired staff cars really was a mechanic. Their very authenticity was their disguise. By July, her network had expanded to over 60 operatives, none fitting the profile of typical resistance members. They included elderly pensioners, teenage girls, a crippled veteran from the Great War, and even a German-born French citizen who worked as a translator for the occupation authority. Each gathered intelligence in plain sight, passed it through a compartmentalized system, and continued their daily lives without arousing suspicion. It was revolutionary, not because it employed new technology or weapons, but because it completely inverted the psychological foundation of espionage itself. The conventional wisdom had always been that spies needed to hide. Eleanor proved that sometimes the best hiding place was in full view. Her most daring implementation of this theory came in late July. Intelligence indicated that a high-ranking SS officer was arriving to oversee the expansion of deportation programs. Capturing his documents could provide crucial information about German intentions and potentially save thousands of lives. Traditional methods would have attempted to ambush his convoy or break into his quarters. High-risk operations with minimal chances of success. Instead, Eleanor arranged for one of her agents, a middle-aged woman who worked as a laundress at the hotel where the officer would stay, to simply collect his uniform for cleaning. The documents were photographed while the uniform was being pressed, then returned with the officer none the wiser. The intelligence reached London the same day, transmitted by a radio operator working from a repair shop across from Gestapo headquarters during an air raid drill. When Hammond received the photographs, along with a detailed explanation of how they'd been obtained, he supposedly remarked to his deputy, "We've been thinking about this entire business backward for years." The backward comment would prove prophetic. Because Eleanor Blackwood wasn't just gathering intelligence, she was completely reversing the fundamental assumptions of how covert operations should work. And that reversal was about to become both her greatest triumph and her greatest danger. As her methods spread and her successes multiplied, she remained unaware that Colonel Kleist was drawing ever closer. The hunter and the innovator were circling each other in a deadly game of intellectual chess, one that would soon force Eleanor to risk everything on one final, audacious gambit. The perfect transmission under pressure. August 15th, 1943. It was the day Lyon held its breath. The Germans, frustrated by continued intelligence leaks and sabotage, imposed new security measures across the city. Identity papers were checked at random. Curfews tightened. Radio detection teams patrolled constantly, equipment more sensitive than anything previously deployed. Eleanor's network was feeling the pressure. 2 peripheral members had been arrested, though neither knew enough to compromise the core operation. Safe houses were being watched. Dead drops were under surveillance. The breathing room they had enjoyed through their unconventional methods was steadily shrinking. Adding to the tension, London had requested an urgent transmission. Allied planners needed comprehensive intelligence on German forces in southern France, troop dispositions, supply depots, anti-aircraft batteries, command centers. Information that would shape the coming invasion of mainland Europe. Eleanor's team had spent weeks gathering the data, a meticulous compilation that represented the most complete picture of German military presence in the region. But getting it to London meant a transmission of unprecedented length, nearly 20 minutes, at a time when the Germans could triangulate a signal in under 5. It was, by any conventional assessment, impossible. Even Martin, loyal and brave, questioned the wisdom of attempting it. "They'll find us before we're halfway through," he argued, during a tense meeting in the back room of a bookshop. "We need to split it into smaller transmissions over several days." Eleanor shook her head. "They're expecting that now. They've adapted to our methods. Small, scattered transmissions from different locations is exactly what they're looking for." She paused, then added, "So, we'll do the opposite. One transmission, complete, from the last place they'd ever expect." Her plan was audacious to the point of seeming suicidal. The transmission would come not from a distant farmhouse or a moving vehicle, but from an apartment directly adjacent to the hotel terminus, the Gestapo's Lyon headquarters. "It's the one place their detection teams won't be monitoring," she explained. "They'll assume no one would be reckless enough to transmit from directly under their noses." But location was just the beginning. Timing was equally crucial. Eleanor had noticed that every Thursday, the Gestapo conducted a staff meeting that included all senior officers and detection specialists. During this 2-hour window, their capability to respond quickly was at its lowest. Additionally, she had arranged for a diversion. 3 small explosions would be detonated at the far edges of the city. Minor enough to cause no casualties, but sufficient to draw attention and response teams away from the center. On the morning of the transmission, Eleanor met with her radio operator, a former postal worker named Claude. They reviewed the plan one final time in the small attic apartment overlooking the square where German officers took their lunch. "If anything goes wrong," she told him, "destroy the codebook and equipment, then use the escape route through the connected buildings. Don't wait for me." Claude, a thin man with perpetually ink-stained fingers, nodded grimly. "And if they catch you?" "They won't," Eleanor said, with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "But if they do, remember I know only my part of the network. That's why we compartmentalized." At precisely 2:30 p.m., as the Gestapo's weekly meeting began, Claude began transmitting. Eleanor stood by the window, watching the square below with apparent casualness, as if simply enjoying the afternoon sun. In reality, she was their early warning system, positioned to spot any approaching detection vans or security teams. The transmission proceeded methodically. 5 minutes passed. 10. Outside, German officers strolled across the square, oblivious to the stream of secrets flowing out directly above their heads. The diversionary explosions had worked. Several police vehicles had sped away from the area earlier. Then, 15 minutes into the transmission, Eleanor spotted him. Colonel Werner Kleist, walking briskly across the square, accompanied by 2 men carrying what appeared to be detection equipment. They weren't heading toward the apartment building. Not yet, but their presence was far from coincidental. "We have company," Eleanor said quietly. "Potential detection team entering the square. Continue transmitting." Claude's fingers never faltered on the key, though sweat beaded on his forehead. 3 more minutes. That's all they needed to complete the transmission. Kleist stopped in the center of the square. One of his men adjusted a dial on his equipment, turning slowly. Eleanor watched, her expression betraying nothing, as the man pointed toward their building. "They've got a direction," she said. "Not precise yet, but they're close. 90 seconds remaining." Below, Kleist was speaking into a radio. More men would be coming. The window was closing. "Transmission complete," Claude whispered, disconnecting the antenna. "Pack up," Eleanor ordered calmly. "We're leaving, not through the stairs." As they had rehearsed, Claude quickly disassembled the radio, packing essential components into a hollowed-out book. Eleanor retrieved their forged papers and emergency ration cards. They moved to the fireplace, not to burn evidence, but because Eleanor had discovered that the building's old chimney system connected to adjacent structures through a maintenance crawl space. Outside, vehicles were arriving. Boots pounded on pavement. Someone shouted orders in German. Eleanor pushed aside the false bricks at the back of the fireplace, revealing a narrow passage. "You first," she told Claude. "I'll replace the bricks from inside." Claude squeezed through the opening. Eleanor followed, carefully replacing the false panel behind them. They crawled through decades of soot and dust, emerging 2 buildings away in what had once been a servant's passage. By the time Kleist's men broke down the door of the apartment, it was empty. No radio, no code books, no evidence of transmission. Just an ordinary room with a cup of cooling coffee on the table. They had vanished, and with them, the intelligence that would help shape the Allied invasion of Europe. 3 days later, London confirmed receipt of the complete transmission. Hammond's coded response was brief. "Athena's method exceeds all expectations. Intelligence crucial to planning. Highest commendation." Eleanor didn't celebrate. She moved to a new safe house, altered her appearance, and began planning their next operation. Because success wasn't just about one transmission or one mission. It was about sustainability, about creating a methodology that could continue functioning even as the enemy adapted. And adapt they would. Because Colonel Kleist wasn't just furious about the missed capture. He was finally beginning to understand what he was truly facing. Not just another resistance cell, but a fundamental reimagining of how intelligence operations could function. A worthy opponent who thought differently than anyone he had hunted before. The game was changing, and for Eleanor Blackwood, the most dangerous phase was just beginning. Because innovation in wartime isn't theoretical, it's paid for in risk, in sacrifice, and sometimes in blood. The imitators, the doubters, and the legacy in motion. In war, innovation spreads quickly, but trust builds slowly. After the Lion transmission, resistance networks across occupied Europe began hearing about the English woman's method. Some tried to replicate it, most couldn't. Not because they doubted the effectiveness, those results were increasingly clear, but because it required a complete psychological reversal that many found too counterintuitive to implement. A Belgian resistance leader supposedly remarked, "Hiding in plain sight sounds clever until the Gestapo is standing right in front of you." What Eleanor's imitators often failed to understand was that her approach wasn't just about visibility, it was about authenticity. Her agents weren't simply pretending to be ordinary citizens. Most of them actually were ordinary citizens who had integrated resistance activities into their genuine daily lives. This distinction proved crucial. Half measures failed catastrophically. A Dutch network attempted to place operators in visible positions without proper cover development and lost 7 members in a single week. A French cell in Bordeaux tried using commercial establishments as fronts without the years of legitimate business history that Eleanor insisted upon. They were identified and eliminated within a month. Even within Allied command, skepticism persisted. A senior SOE officer in the North African section dismissed what he called the Athena experiment as a fluke of circumstances unlikely to be replicated elsewhere. He continued using traditional methods and continued losing agents at alarming rates. But the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. By September 1943, networks employing Eleanor's methodologies were showing significantly improved survival rates and operational effectiveness. London began formally incorporating elements of her approach into training programs, though never as comprehensively as she implemented them in the field. The true believers weren't in headquarters, but on the ground. Agents who had seen firsthand what happened when conventional wisdom was inverted. Martin, once skeptical, became her strongest advocate. He helped establish 3 sub-networks using Eleanor's principles, each operating independently, yet coordinated through a system so compartmentalized that the capture of any single cell would reveal nothing about the others. "The genius isn't in any single tactic," he told a newly arrived SOE agent. "It's in rethinking every assumption we've been taught about how to survive." Colonel Kleist, meanwhile, was conducting his own analysis. After the failed raid on the transmission site, he sequestered himself for 3 days, reviewing every report, every pattern, every anomaly. Unlike his colleagues, he didn't blame the failure on technical problems or bad luck. He recognized it as the product of a specific intelligence methodology, one he was only beginning to understand. "We've been hunting phantoms," he told his inner circle at a secure briefing. "Looking for resistance operators who behave like resistance operators. But our adversary has created something different. People who don't need to hide because they aren't doing anything that appears suspicious." His superiors were skeptical. "Everyone leaves traces," one Abwehr official insisted. "Increased surveillance, more checkpoints, more informants." Kleist shook his head. "Those are precisely the countermeasures they've designed their system to circumvent. We need to think differently." He paused, then added, "I believe we're dealing with a specific intelligence officer, someone with formal training but unorthodox thinking. Someone who sees patterns where others see only chaos." How close he was to the truth, Eleanor would never know. But she sensed the change in German tactics. Random searches decreased, targeted observation increased. Obvious resistance members were sometimes left uncaptured, used as bait to trace their connections. The hunters were adapting. In response, Eleanor evolved her methods again. She began what she called paradoxical operations, intelligence activities specifically designed to be partially discovered, revealing false networks that distracted from the real ones. She planted information that would lead the Germans to empty safe houses while the actual operations continued elsewhere. Most radically, she occasionally allowed low-value intelligence to be captured, just enough to convince the Germans they had successfully penetrated her network, when in fact they were being fed exactly what Eleanor wanted them to believe. By October, the intelligence war in southern France had become a sophisticated battle of minds, German counterintelligence adapting to Eleanor's methods, Eleanor adapting to their adaptations, each side evolving in response to the other. London marveled at the effectiveness, but worried about sustainability. "How long can Athena maintain this level of innovation?" Hammond asked in a secure communication. "Every operative has limits." Eleanor's response was characteristically direct. Innovation isn't optional. It's our only advantage. What neither side fully recognized was that the methodologies Eleanor had developed weren't just changing outcomes in France. They were reshaping the fundamental principles of modern intelligence operations. Concepts like non-official cover, legitimate front activities, and behavioral consistency would become standard tradecraft in the decades following the war, their origins often forgotten or misattributed. But in the autumn of 1943, these were revolutionary and dangerous. Because the more successful Eleanor's network became, the more resources the Germans devoted to finding its architect. Colonel Kleist had made it his personal mission. And as winter approached, bringing shorter days and longer nights, the hunt intensified. For Eleanor, the theoretical had become visceral. Each innovation wasn't just an academic exercise. It was a lifeline for her agents, for the resistance, for the Allied cause itself. And somewhere between the coded messages and the constant adaptation, the classics professor from Cambridge had transformed into something her instructors could never have predicted. A field operative whose legacy would outlive the war itself. But first, she had to survive it, and Colonel Kleist was drawing ever closer. The breaking point and the cost of innovation. By November of 1943, Eleanor Blackwood had operated successfully behind enemy lines for 8 months, nearly 4 times the average survival period for agents in occupied France. Her network had expanded to cover much of the southern region, with sub-networks extending into central France and even parts of the Italian border. The intelligence they provided had shaped Allied bombing campaigns, informed resistance operations, and laid groundwork for the invasion planners in London. By any measure, it was an extraordinary success. But success in wartime carries its own weight. The constant vigilance, the split-second decisions, the knowledge that a single error could cost dozens of lives. All of it exacted a toll. Eleanor rarely slept more than 4 hours at a stretch. She had lost weight. The headaches that had once been occasional now came almost daily. Martin noticed the changes. "You need rest," he told her during a rare, quiet moment as they walked through a public park, German soldiers strolling nearby. "Even the best minds need recovery," Eleanor smiled faintly. "There will be time for rest after the war. Not if you collapse before then," he countered. "London has offered to extract you 3 times. You've refused each time. Why?" She stopped near a stone fountain, watching children playing despite the occupation, despite everything. "Because the network functions because of consistency," she said after a moment. "Remove a key component, and the entire structure is compromised." What she didn't say, couldn't say, was that the work had become more than a mission. It had become her purpose. The academic who had once found meaning in ancient texts now found it in saving lives, in outwitting the occupation, in proving that intelligence could triumph over brutality. But even as Eleanor's network reached its peak effectiveness, the environment was changing. The Germans, under pressure on multiple fronts, increased their ruthlessness. Reprisals for resistance activities became more severe. Entire villages were punished for single acts of sabotage. The moral calculus grew heavier with each operation. Then came the crisis point. In early December, a sub-network in Grenoble was compromised. 3 agents captured, 2 immediately executed. The third, a young woman named Sophie, who had been one of Eleanor's first recruits, was taken for interrogation. Sophie knew portions of the main network structure. Not everything. Eleanor's compartmentalization had prevented that. but enough to endanger key operatives if she broke under questioning. And the Germans had methods that broke even the strongest wills eventually. The news reached Eleanor through an emergency contact. She called an immediate meeting with her core team in a church during evening mass, the backdrop of ritual and worship providing cover for their whispered conference. "We have 48 hours at most," she told them. "After that, we must assume compromised." Martin's face was grim. "What are our options?" "Evacuate critical personnel, shut down operations in the affected sectors, activate fallback protocols." She spoke with the calm precision that had become her hallmark, despite the churning beneath the surface. Then she added, "And we need to attempt extraction." The others stared at her. Extraction meant a rescue operation, breaking into a Gestapo facility to retrieve a captured agent. It was considered nearly impossible, a desperate measure rarely attempted, and even more rarely successful. "It's suicide," one of her lieutenants whispered. "It's necessary," Eleanor countered. "Not just for the intelligence Sophie could reveal, but because we made a promise to every agent. We don't abandon our own." The real reason, which Eleanor kept to herself, was more personal. Sophie had joined because of her, had trusted her methods, her leadership, her promise that this new approach to resistance would keep them safer. That promise now hung in the balance. The operation she designed violated every principle of caution. It was direct, high risk, and depended on timing more than deception. Sophie was being held at Gestapo headquarters, the same building near which Eleanor had conducted her daring transmission months earlier. Security was formidable, but Eleanor had studied the facility for months, mapping routines, identifying vulnerabilities. Her plan centered on a single weak point: the building's power system. Like many structures requisitioned by occupation forces, it had been hastily modified to serve new functions. The electrical infrastructure was overloaded, prone to failures, especially during peak usage hours. Eleanor's team created a cascading power surge that would trigger a blackout, affecting not just the headquarters, but the surrounding blocks. During the darkness and confusion, a small extraction team would enter through the service entrance, locate Sophie, and bring her out through a pre-identified route. It was precise, methodical, and terrifyingly dangerous. Eleanor, against all protocol, insisted on leading the extraction team herself. "You're too valuable," Martin argued. "If you're captured, then someone else will continue the work," she interrupted. "This is my responsibility." The operation was set for December 8th, a cold, clear night with no moon. The power surge was triggered at precisely 9:37 p.m., plunging the area into darkness. Backup generators would activate within minutes, so the window was narrow. Eleanor, dressed in the uniform of a German auxiliary nurse, a disguise that would explain her presence during an emergency, led 2 team members through the confusion. Guards were focused on securing exits, not watching internal movements. They reached the detention area during the crucial moments of disorientation. Sophie was in the 3rd cell, barely conscious, her face bruised from interrogation. She looked up as Eleanor unlocked the door, recognition dawning slowly. "Athena?" she whispered, using Eleanor's code name. "Time to go home," Eleanor replied softly, helping her to her feet. They were halfway to the exit when the lights flickered back on. An alarm sounded. A guard shouted in German. Then gunfire, a short, sharp burst that echoed down the corridor. One of the extraction team fell, blood blooming across his shirt. The second team member returned fire, creating precious seconds of cover. Eleanor half carried Sophie toward the service exit, the sound of boots pounding behind them. They emerged into an alley just as more guards rounded the corner of the building. The second team member pushed them toward a waiting car, then turned back, pistol raised. "Go," he shouted. "I'll hold them." Eleanor hesitated for only a moment, then pulled Sophie toward the vehicle. Behind them, more gunfire erupted. The second team member fell. German voices shouted orders. The car sped away, tires squealing on the cobblestones. Sophie slumped against Eleanor, semi-conscious. They had made it, but at terrible cost. 2 dead, possibly a third if the driver, hit by a stray bullet, didn't reach medical attention quickly. As they switched vehicles at a prearranged point, Eleanor felt a wave of something beyond exhaustion. It was doubt, raw and unfamiliar. Not doubt in her methods or her mission, but in the calculation that had become central to resistance work, the weighing of lives, the acceptance of losses for greater gains. She had rescued Sophie, protected the network, fulfilled her promise. But she had lost good people, people who had trusted her judgment, followed her lead, believed in her vision. That night, in a safe house on the outskirts of Lyon, Eleanor faced the true cost of innovation in wartime. It wasn't measured in theoretical risks or statistical probabilities. It was measured in blood, in grief, in the faces of those who didn't return. For the first time since her arrival in France, she wrote a personal message to London, separate from her operational report. We cannot measure success solely by intelligence gathered. The human equation must remain primary. Otherwise, we become what we're fighting against. Hammond's response was delayed but direct. Understood. But remember, your work has saved thousands. The equation is larger than any single operation. Eleanor knew he was right. Yet as she sat beside Sophie's bed, watching the young woman finally sleep without nightmares, she wondered about the true legacy of what she had created. Was it the methodology that would reshape intelligence work for decades to come? Or was it the moral complexity that came with it? The burden of decisions that balanced lives against information, immediate costs against future gains? The answer, she was beginning to realize, was both. Because the woman whose secret mission was changing the course of history was also being changed by it, step by step, decision by decision. And the final chapters of that transformation were still to come. The man behind the pursuit and the final gambit. Colonel Werner Kleist was not a typical Nazi. Before the war, he had been a professor of criminology at Heidelberg University, specializing in pattern analysis and behavioral prediction. He approached intelligence work not as an ideologue, but as an intellectual puzzle, a quality that made him both more effective and more dangerous than his more fanatical colleagues. By December 1943, Kleist had assembled a comprehensive theory about the resistance network operating in southern France. He called it the Athena hypothesis, named after the code designation he had intercepted in fragmented transmissions. In a secure briefing room at Gestapo headquarters, walls covered with maps, timelines, and photographs, he presented his conclusions to a select group of counterintelligence specialists. We are not dealing with conventional resistance methodology, he explained, pointing to a chart showing pattern analyses of operations. The network operates on principles of behavioral inversion, doing precisely what we have been trained not to expect. His audience, accustomed to brute force approaches, seemed skeptical. The failed extraction attempt last week provides confirmation, Kleist continued. It was the first operation that followed conventional resistance tactics, direct, forceful, reactive, rather than proactive. And it failed precisely because it abandoned the principles that have made this network so elusive. One officer interrupted. Perhaps they've simply run out of innovations. Kleist shook his head. No, they were forced to abandon their methodology due to time constraints. The agent they extracted must have held critical information that couldn't wait for a more measured approach. He paused. Which tells us something important. Their leader prioritizes personnel over protocol when pressed. That's a vulnerability. What Kleist couldn't know was how close his analysis came to the truth. Eleanor had indeed compromised her methodological principles to save Sophie, a decision that created the first significant crack in her operational security. Following the extraction, Eleanor accelerated the restructuring of the network. Vulnerable cells were shut down. Communication protocols changed. Safe houses abandoned. It was necessary but disruptive, creating gaps in intelligence collection, just as Allied planners were finalizing invasion strategies. London noticed the disruption. Hammond sent an encrypted message. Understand security concerns, but critical intelligence gaps developing. Can you restore full operational capacity? Eleanor's response was honest. Restoration underway, complete coverage unlikely before February. Suggest supplementary sources until then. What she didn't explain was the personal toll. Sophie's injuries had been severe, not just physical, but psychological. The young woman who had once been vivacious and fearless, now startled at shadows, woke screaming from nightmares. Eleanor spent nights by her bedside, witnessing firsthand the human cost of the war they were fighting. During one lucid moment, Sophie grasped Eleanor's hand. They knew things, she whispered, about our methods, about patterns. A man asked questions, not about what we did, but how we thought. The description matched what Eleanor had heard about Colonel Kleist. Unlike other Gestapo interrogators who focused on extracting names and locations, Kleist sought to understand underlying methodologies. He wasn't just hunting resistance members. He was hunting their operational philosophy. This realization forced Eleanor to confront an uncomfortable truth. The very innovation that had made her network successful was now being studied and potentially countered. The hunter was learning from the hunted. She faced a strategic dilemma. Continuing with modified versions of her existing methods risked increasing vulnerability as Kleist's understanding grew. Reverting to conventional tradecraft would surrender their key advantage. A third option was needed. Something so unexpected that even an adversary who expected the unexpected would be caught off guard. The solution came to her while watching German officers in a cafe, meticulously checking their surroundings for surveillance before discussing sensitive matters. They were being cautious, following security protocols, and in doing so, marking themselves as people with something to hide. What if, Eleanor proposed to Martin during a secure meeting, instead of making our operations invisible, we make them hyper-visible? So visible they're dismissed as impossible. Martin stared at her. You mean operate openly, without any concealment? Not exactly. I mean, we design operations that appear to be decoys or diversions, so blatant that they're disregarded as serious intelligence activities. She leaned forward. Kleist is looking for subtlety now. He expects us to be hiding in plain sight. What if we're not hiding at all? The concept was radical, even by Eleanor's standards. It involved creating what she called anti-cover, operational personas that were so conspicuously engaged in seemingly suspicious activity that they would be dismissed as either decoys or incompetents. Her first test case was a radio operator, who set up his equipment in a park frequented by German officers, openly fiddling with dials and antennas. He was questioned 3 times, his equipment examined twice, and each time dismissed as a harmless radio enthusiast because no actual intelligence officer would be so flagrantly obvious. Behind this display of bumbling amateurism was a sophisticated operation. The hobbyist equipment concealed a secondary transmission system that sent actual intelligence during the fake adjustments and tests. Eleanor called it hiding through ridicule, becoming so apparently inept that serious consideration was beneath contempt. It worked because it exploited a fundamental human bias, the assumption that real threats don't advertise themselves. As January 1944 arrived, Eleanor implemented this approach across the network. Agents adopted personas designed to attract initial attention, but deflect serious investigation. A supposed black marketeer whose bumbling attempts to sell contraband were so obvious that he was written off as a petty criminal, rather than the intelligence gatherer he actually was. A drunk who stumbled near German installations, seemingly too intoxicated to be a threat, while observing security procedures. London was baffled by the reports. Hammond's response bordered on alarm. Approach seems contrary to all security protocols. Explain rationale urgently. Eleanor's explanation was characteristically precise. When the enemy expects invisibility, visibility becomes the perfect cover. When they expect sophistication, apparent incompetence becomes armor. Amazingly, it worked. German intelligence resources, already stretched thin by the demands of a multi-front war, couldn't afford to focus on targets that appeared to be obvious decoys or insignificant annoyances. They were looking for shadows, not fools performing in broad daylight. Kleist alone sensed the strategy shift. In a report to Berlin that was intercepted and decoded by Allied intelligence, he wrote, "The Athena network has evolved again, adopting a form of operational caricature that exploits our own assessment biases. Recommend reevaluation of all dismissed suspects, particularly those deemed too obvious for serious consideration." But his warning came too late. By the time German counterintelligence began reassessing previously dismissed targets, Eleanor's network had already gathered and transmitted critical intelligence about coastal defenses, troop dispositions, and supply vulnerabilities across southern France. This information flowed directly into the planning for Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France that would complement the Normandy landings. Eleanor's hyper-visible network, operating under the very noses of their hunters, provided details so precise that Allied commanders could identify exactly where and when to strike for maximum impact. As spring approached, the strategic balance in France was shifting. German forces, pressured on multiple fronts, were increasingly defensive. The resistance grew bolder. The sense of inevitable liberation began to permeate even the most cautious conversations. Eleanor, however, knew that the most dangerous period was still ahead. As the occupation grew more desperate, it would become more brutal. As liberation drew nearer, risks would increase exponentially. The final phase would require one more innovation, perhaps her most audacious yet. Because the woman whose secret mission was changing history wasn't finished. She had one last move in her strategic arsenal, one final reversal that even Kleist wouldn't anticipate. The endgame was approaching, and with it, the ultimate test of her revolutionary methodology. The woman behind the gun and the cost of deception. By April 1944, Eleanor Blackwood had become more than an intelligence operative. She had become a legend within resistance circles, a shadow figure whose methods were whispered about in safe houses across occupied Europe. The Germans had placed a substantial reward for information leading to Athena, though they still had only fragmented descriptions of who they were actually seeking. What few knew, even within her own network, was that Eleanor was exhausted. The constant vigilance, the weight of life and death decisions, the accumulated strain of nearly a year behind enemy lines, all had taken their toll. A persistent cough had developed in the damp spring air. Sleep came in broken fragments between nightmares. Yet she pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that the Allied invasion was approaching. Every piece of intelligence, every sabotage operation, every disruption to German preparations could save lives when the landings finally came. In London, concern about her condition grew. Hammond sent an uncharacteristically personal message. Medical officer advises extraction based on latest reports. Your value to the overall war effort extends beyond current assignment. Authorization for replacement team granted. Eleanor's response was brief. Replacement would compromise network integrity at critical juncture. Request denied. Will reevaluate post-summer operations. What she didn't say was that she had already designed her exit strategy, not just for herself, but for the entire network. As Allied forces pushed inland from their eventual landing sites, the role of intelligence networks would shift from information gathering to direct support of advancing troops. Resistance cells would transition to open warfare, abandoning the shadows entirely. This transition period would be when agents were most vulnerable, caught between their covert identities and their emerging roles as active combatants. Eleanor had spent months developing protocols for this phase, creating what she called identity bridging, controlled revelations of true allegiances timed to maximize protection during the chaotic period of liberation. Colonel Kleist, meanwhile, had not abandoned his pursuit. By May, he had narrowed his focus to a geographic area encompassing Lyon and its surroundings. His analysis suggested the Athena network's command structure was based there, coordinating subnetworks across the region. What he lacked was a specific target, a name, a face, a location. The hypervisible decoys had successfully drawn attention away from the actual operational core. But Kleist was patient, methodical, and increasingly desperate as German military fortunes declined. The breaking point came in early June. Allied forces landed in Normandy on the 6th, establishing the long-awaited Second Front. Throughout France, resistance activities intensified, shifting from covert intelligence gathering to overt sabotage and direct attacks on German positions. In the south, Eleanor's network maintained its discipline, focusing on high-value intelligence rather than premature confrontation. This restraint, against the emotional tide of pending liberation, was perhaps her most difficult leadership challenge. "Our moment will come," she told her core team during a tense meeting after news of the Normandy landings reached them. "But rushing now would squander everything we've built. The invasion of southern France will need our intelligence more than it needs symbolic gestures." Not everyone agreed. Some resistance members, particularly younger fighters, argued that the time for caution had passed. A few broke with network protocols, launching independent attacks on German patrols, brave but strategically insignificant actions that provoked harsh reprisals. Eleanor understood their impatience, but couldn't condone the breaches. Each undisciplined attack threatened the broader network and compromised the intelligence flow that would be crucial for the southern landings. It was during this period of internal tension that Kleist finally found his opening. One of the breakaway resistance fighters, captured after an impulsive attack, broke under interrogation. He knew little about the main network, but he provided one crucial detail: a location where network couriers sometimes exchanged information, a small bookshop near the university district. Kleist didn't move immediately. Instead, he established surveillance, watching patterns, collecting data points. The bookshop itself revealed nothing suspicious. The owner, an elderly man with thick glasses, seemed an unlikely resistance member. But Kleist's observers noticed something else. A classics professor who visited regularly, browsing the ancient history section before making small purchases. Her behavior wasn't unusual, but her timing was consistent with suspected communication windows. After 3 weeks of observation, Kleist had enough to justify closer investigation. Background checks revealed she was Eleanor Blackwood, a British academic who had supposedly returned to England in 1940. Yet here she was, living under a French identity as Elise Beaumont, teaching part-time at a local school. The pieces finally aligned: academic background explaining analytical capabilities, British nationality explaining Allied connections, language skills explaining ability to operate seamlessly in occupied France. Everything fit the profile he had constructed of the elusive Athena. Kleist prepared carefully, knowing that a direct arrest might trigger network contingency protocols, potentially losing the larger operation. Instead, he planned a sequential approach: surveillance leading to intelligence gathering, leading to the identification of key network nodes before any arrests were made. What he couldn't know was that Eleanor had already detected the surveillance. Years of hyper-awareness had attuned her to the subtle signs. The same faces appearing too regularly, the slight hesitation of someone following at a distance, the faint radio clicks of communication devices. She faced the most difficult decision of her entire mission: evacuation or counter-surveillance. Evacuation meant abandoning the network at the most critical moment, just weeks before the planned southern invasion. Counter-surveillance meant deliberately engaging with those watching her, a dangerous game with the highest possible stakes. Eleanor chose the latter. She implemented what she called the final inversion, a strategy so counterintuitive that it violated every principle of agent survival. She began making herself more visible to her watchers, establishing a predictable routine that would be easy to track. She visited locations known to be under German surveillance. She engaged in conversations near known informants. She telegraphed movements that appeared to reveal network operations. It was all carefully orchestrated misdirection. Each apparent security lapse led to false locations, false contacts, false conclusions. She was creating a shadow network for Kleist to discover, one that would keep his resources occupied while the real operations continued undetected. The strain was immense. Every day involved multiple layers of deception, playing the role of someone trying to avoid surveillance while actually choreographing what that surveillance would see. The cognitive demands were exhausting, requiring constant awareness of how each action would be perceived and interpreted. Martin, watching her push herself beyond reasonable limits, confronted her after a particularly grueling day. "You're going to collapse before they ever arrest you," he said bluntly. "This isn't sustainable." Eleanor's response was quiet, but firm. "It doesn't need to be sustainable. It only needs to last until August." August was when Allied planners had tentatively scheduled the southern invasion, Operation Dragoon. Every day Eleanor could keep Kleist focused on shadows and misdirection was another day the real network could gather the intelligence that would make that invasion successful. The personal cost continued to mount. Her cough worsened. Weight dropped from her already thin frame. Dark circles became permanent fixtures beneath her eyes. Yet she maintained the performance with flawless precision, playing the role of a spy trying not to appear like a spy, leading her hunters exactly where she wanted them to go. Kleist, methodical and thorough, accumulated what he believed was definitive evidence. Eleanor's Elise Beaumont identity had inconsistencies he could trace. Her movements corresponded with suspected network activities. Her background provided the perfect cover for an intelligence operative. By late July, he was ready to move beyond surveillance to intervention. Not an arrest, not yet, but a direct approach designed to apply pressure and observe reactions. He selected a public location, a cafe where Elise took lunch most Thursdays, planning to engage her in conversation that would seem casual but contain subtle indicators that her cover was compromised. The encounter, when it came, was brief but charged with unspoken meaning. Kleist, introducing himself as a university administrator interested in classical literature, joined her table uninvited. Their conversation, ostensibly about Greek philosophy, carried unmistakable undercurrents. "I've always been fascinated by strategies of deception in ancient texts," he commented, watching her reactions carefully. "Especially the Trojan horse, the idea that something can appear to be one thing while concealing another purpose entirely." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "The Greeks understood that perception often matters more than reality," she replied. "We see what we expect to see, even when the truth is hiding in plain sight." It was acknowledgement without confession, recognition without surrender. Both knew the game that was being played. Both understood the stakes. As Kleist left the cafe, he felt the certainty of a hunter who has finally glimpsed his prey after a long pursuit. Eleanor felt the weight of knowing that the final phase had begun, the most dangerous act in her long performance. What neither fully appreciated was how their intellectual duel had transcended the typical boundaries of intelligence and counterintelligence. It had become a contest of methodologies, of approaches to human perception and deception. And its outcome would affect far more than their individual fates. Because the woman whose secret mission was changing history now faced her ultimate challenge, using herself as bait to protect the network she had built, the agents she had trained, and the intelligence that could help liberate a nation. The endgame had arrived. The boy who sniped with a tank had become the woman who outthought an empire. When the summer heat finally broke over the ancient streets of Lyon, it revealed more than bullet-scarred buildings and curfew-emptied squares. It revealed the culmination of a methodological revolution, born not from military academies or intelligence headquarters, but from the mind of one woman who refused to accept conventional limitations. Among those swept up in that revolution was Colonel Werner Kleist. By August 1944, he had assembled what he believed was an irrefutable case against Elise Beaumont. Surveillance reports, communication patterns, identity discrepancies. Everything pointed to her as the architect of the Athena network. Yet something held him back from immediate arrest. Perhaps it was professional curiosity, the desire to understand his opponent completely before claiming victory. Perhaps it was intuition, warning that something about the evidence felt too neat, too accessible for an adversary who had eluded capture for so long. Whatever the reason, Kleist decided on a final verification. Rather than arresting Eleanor directly, he moved against what he believed were peripheral network members, people whose surveillance had connected them to Elise through apparently clandestine meetings. In a coordinated operation on August 10th, Gestapo teams apprehended 5 suspects across Lyon. The interrogations began immediately, focused on establishing connections to the woman Kleist was now convinced was Athena. The results were bewildering. None of the suspects revealed anything useful, not because they resisted questioning, but because they genuinely had nothing to reveal. The bookseller was actually a bookseller. The cafe owner was actually a cafe owner. The university colleague was actually a university colleague. None had any connection to resistance activities. Kleist reviewed the surveillance records again, looking for the flaw in his analysis. There was none. The patterns were clear. Elise had met with these people repeatedly in ways that matched known resistance communication methods. The evidence was undeniable. What he couldn't see was that the evidence had been deliberately created. Eleanor had constructed an entire fictional network around herself. People she met regularly, locations she visited consistently, patterns she established methodically, all designed to be discovered. Meanwhile, the actual network operated through entirely different channels, using methods and personnel that had never been connected to Elise Beaumont in any way that surveillance could detect. It was the ultimate expression of her methodology, not hiding the existence of a network, but creating a decoy network so convincing that it absorbed all counterintelligence resources, while the real operation continued undetected. On August 15, 1944, Allied forces landed on the southern coast of France. Operation Dragoon began with precision strikes against German defensive positions. Positions identified through intelligence provided by Eleanor's network. Resistance groups throughout the region rose in coordinated support, targeting communication centers, transport hubs, and command facilities. The invasion caught the German forces in a state of disarray. Resources that should have been monitoring coastal approaches had been diverted to counterintelligence operations focused on phantom networks. Units that should have been reinforcing defensive positions were searching for resistance cells that didn't exist where they were expected to exist. In Lyon, Kleist received the news of the landings with the sinking realization that he had been outmaneuvered at a strategic level. The Athena network hadn't just gathered intelligence. It had manipulated the entire counterintelligence apparatus into focusing on shadows while the real threat developed elsewhere. His response was immediate. He ordered the arrest of Elise Beaumont, determined to capture the architect of this deception before she could escape in the chaos of the Allied advance. But when his men reached her apartment, it was empty, not hastily abandoned, but methodically cleared. No personal items, no evidence of rapid departure. It appeared as if Elise Beaumont had never truly lived there at all. What Kleist couldn't know was that Eleanor had implemented the final phase of her exit strategy days earlier. As Allied forces approached, she had systematically shed the Elise identity, transitioning to a new role coordinating between advancing Allied units and local resistance groups. She left behind a message for Kleist, not written down, nothing so obvious, but embedded in the pattern of her disappearance. The carefully staged apartment, the precisely timed vanishing, the complete absence of trail. It was a final demonstration of the methodology she had pioneered, a textbook example of controlling perception rather than simply hiding reality. As German forces retreated northward, Eleanor's network transitioned from covert intelligence gathering to overt support operations. Agents who had spent months or years concealing their activities now emerged as guides, interpreters, and local liaisons for Allied military units. The hypervisible became truly visible. The hidden remained hidden. Each operative followed the identity-bridging protocols Eleanor had designed, revealing themselves selectively to Allied forces while maintaining security against potential reprisals during the chaotic period of transition. Eleanor herself coordinated these efforts from a series of temporary headquarters, moving northward as the Allied advance continued. Her health, compromised by months of strain and insufficient rest, deteriorated further. But she refused evacuation, determined to complete the mission she had begun. In London, Hammond received regular updates on the network's transition and Eleanor's condition. His messages grew increasingly direct. Medical evacuation now considered essential, not optional. Your work is complete, Athena. Return for debriefing and treatment. Eleanor's final response from the field was characteristic. Transition protocols still being implemented. Will return when network security confirmed. Estimated completion, September 5th. She kept that timeline with typical precision. On September 5, 1944, as Allied forces secured Lyon and pushed northward toward the German border, Eleanor Blackwood finally agreed to extraction. She handed over remaining coordination responsibilities to Martin, who had been preparing for this transition for months. Their parting was brief. No dramatic speeches, no emotional declarations. Just a quiet moment of acknowledgement between two people who had reshaped the nature of intelligence operations through shared risk and innovation. The methods will continue, Martin assured her. Not just here, not just now. Eleanor nodded. They were never about winning just this war, she replied. They were about understanding how perception shapes reality in any conflict, in any era. When she boarded the military transport plane that would return her to England, few of the other passengers noticed the thin, tired-looking woman in civilian clothes. There were no medals visible, no uniform indicating rank or achievement, nothing to suggest that she had just concluded one of the most successful intelligence operations of the entire war. The official reports never used her full name. They referenced Agent Athena, the Lion Network, innovative counterintelligence measures. The specific methodologies she had developed were classified, studied by intelligence services, adapted and implemented in subsequent conflicts across the globe. Eleanor herself never sought recognition. After medical treatment and debriefing, she was offered various positions within the intelligence establishment. She declined them all, returning instead to academia, not to classics, but to a new field emerging from the crucible of wartime experience: cognitive psychology, the study of how humans perceive, process, and respond to information. When asked years later about her wartime service, she would smile slightly and change the subject. But in her teaching and research, the principles she had developed in the field found new expression. The manipulation of expectation, the inversion of established patterns, the recognition that how people think determines what they see. Her former students, some of whom went on to careers in intelligence services themselves, often noted that Professor Blackwood approached psychological theory differently than her colleagues. Less abstractly, more practically, with an uncanny insight into how perception could be shaped and directed. If you had visited her office at Cambridge in the 1960s, you might have noticed a small bronze statue of Athena on her bookshelf, the Greek goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. No plaque, no inscription, nothing to indicate its significance. And if you'd asked about it, she might have smiled and said, "A reminder that wisdom sometimes requires seeing the world backward to move forward." It's easy in hindsight to quantify war through statistics. Intelligence gathered, operations conducted, battles won. But stories like Eleanor Blackwood's remind us that war is ultimately about perception, about who controls the narrative, who shapes understanding, who redefines what is possible and what is not. Eleanor didn't win through resources or firepower or even traditional bravery. She won by fundamentally reimagining how intelligence operations could function when traditional approaches failed. She asked questions that nobody else had the vision or courage to ask. What if hiding isn't always the answer? What if visibility could be the perfect cover? And in those questions lived the seeds of methodologies that would influence intelligence work for generations to come. Not just techniques, but entire philosophical approaches to the relationship between appearance and reality, between what is seen and what remains hidden. Perhaps that's the true legacy of operatives like her. Not the number of secrets uncovered or enemies deceived, but the number of minds forever changed by the realization that reality itself is malleable, shaped by perception, by expectation, and by those rare individuals who see what others cannot see and do what others believe cannot be done. Because one woman decided to look at the battlefield inside out,